July 4, 1943, 03:15 hours, northern face of the Kursk salient, Soviet Union. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter pressed his face against the periscope of his Panzer Four, scanning the predawn darkness through the optical sight that represented the finest German precision engineering. His crew had been awake for 2 hours, performing final checks on their tank before Operation Citadel, the massive offensive that would decide the Eastern Front. The intelligence briefings had been clear. Soviet tank forces would collapse under German technical superiority. The T-34 tanks they would face were crude machines built by slave labor in Ural factories, welded so poorly that armor plates cracked under their own weight, operated by barely trained peasants who couldn't read their own instruments. German tankers had been told these facts repeatedly through training films, technical manuals, and officer briefings since the summer of 1941. Richter believed every word. His Panzer Four Ausführung G carried a 75mm Quade K-40 gun, with penetration capabilities exceeding any previous German tank weapon. His crew had trained for 8 months specifically for this operation. They represented the elite of the Panzerwaffe, equipped with the latest technology, supported by the most advanced military doctrine ever developed. In exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes, Klaus Richter would discover that everything he had been taught about Soviet tank capabilities was a carefully constructed lie. The T-34 wasn't crude, it was revolutionary, and the Red Army had built 14,000 of them. The mathematics of armoured warfare were about to be rewritten, not through superior German engineering or tactical brilliance, but through a Soviet design philosophy that had abandoned elegance for brutal effectiveness. The T-34 medium tank would prove that technical sophistication meant nothing when facing a machine designed specifically to win a war of industrial attrition. Operation Citadel represented the largest concentration of German armoured forces ever assembled for a single offensive. 900,000 men, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, 10,000 artillery pieces. The Wehrmacht had stripped other fronts to assemble this overwhelming force, betting everything on crushing the Soviet salient at Kursk and regaining strategic initiative in the east. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. 2 massive pincer movements would converge on Kursk from north and south, encircling and destroying Soviet forces in the salient. German commanders expected to repeat the stunning victories of 1941 and 1942, when Panzer spearheads had shattered Soviet defences and advanced hundreds of kilometres in weeks. The German army had invested heavily in new equipment specifically for this operation. The Panzer Ausführung D tank, rushed into production despite continuing mechanical problems, brought 75mm guns with superior range and penetration. The Ferdinand tank destroyer mounted an 88mm gun in a heavily armoured casemate that German engineers claimed was invulnerable to Soviet anti-tank weapons. Even the standard Panzer Four had been upgraded with longer guns and additional armour. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. German intelligence assessments painted a picture of Soviet weakness that justified German confidence. Reports claimed Soviet tank production had collapsed under German bombing and factory evacuation. The T-34 was described as mechanically unreliable, with transmission failures occurring after only a few hundred kilometers of operation. Soviet crews supposedly received minimal training, often going into combat with only hours of experience operating their vehicles. These assessments contained fragments of truth twisted into complete misunderstanding. Soviet tank production had indeed been disrupted by the German invasion of 1941. Entire factory complexes had been dismantled and relocated eastward beyond German bomber range. The process created months of chaos as machinery was transported by rail to the Urals and Siberia, then reassembled in new facilities. But German intelligence had failed to grasp the scale of Soviet industrial mobilization. The relocated factories weren't just rebuilt, they were expanded. Tank production that had stuttered to near halt in late 1941 had surged to unprecedented levels by 1943. The Soviets were producing more T-34 tanks in a single month than Germany produced tanks of all types in a quarter. The Tankograd facility in Chelyabinsk, created by merging the evacuated Kirov plant from Leningrad with the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, had become the largest tank production facility in the world. The complex employed over 60,000 workers, operating in 3 shifts, producing T-34 tanks and heavy KV series tanks simultaneously. The facility could complete a T-34 every 30 minutes during peak production. The Gorky automobile plant, evacuated from Moscow in 1941, was producing T-34 tanks using assembly line techniques borrowed from American automotive manufacturing. The Ural tank factory, number 183, the original T-34 design bureau, had expanded production capacity 5-fold since its evacuation from Kharkov. By July 1943, Soviet industry was producing over 1,000 T-34 tanks monthly, a rate that exceeded total German tank production across all models and manufacturers. German tankers entering Operation Citadel knew none of this. They knew only what intelligence briefings had told them. Soviet tank forces were depleted, poorly equipped, and inadequately trained. The reality waiting in the fields around Kursk would shatter these comfortable assumptions with devastating finality. The T-34 medium tank had entered production in 1940, designed by engineer Mikhail Koshkin at the Kharkov locomotive factory. The design emerged from bitter lessons learned during the Spanish Civil War and border conflicts with Japan, where Soviet tanks had proven vulnerable to anti-tank weapons and inadequate for modern mobile warfare. Koshkin's design team made revolutionary choices that contradicted prevailing tank design orthodoxy. They mounted a 76mm gun, far larger than guns on comparable medium tanks from any nation. They used sloped armor throughout the design, maximizing protection without excessive weight. They installed a diesel engine, providing better fuel economy and reduced fire risk compared to gasoline engines. Most radically, they designed for mass production above all other considerations. The T-34 wasn't elegant. Armor plates were welded roughly with visible seams and imperfections. The transmission was crude, requiring enormous physical strength to shift gears. The crew compartment was cramped and uncomfortable. Vision devices were basic compared to German optics. Every design choice prioritized factors that would matter in sustained industrial warfare. The wide tracks distributed weight effectively, providing excellent mobility in mud and snow that immobilized German tanks. The sloped armor caused German anti-tank rounds to ricochet harmlessly at angles that would penetrate flat armor plates. The diesel engine, though producing less horsepower than German gasoline engines, ran reliably on lower quality fuel and didn't explode into flames when penetrated by armor-piercing rounds. German tankers who first encountered T-34 tanks in the summer of 1941 had filed alarmed reports about Soviet tank capabilities. These reports noted that standard German 37mm anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate T-34 armor at normal combat ranges. The T-34's 76mm gun destroyed German Panzer III and Panzer Four, tanks with single shots at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The Soviet tank's cross-country mobility exceeded any German vehicle. These reports reached German high command but were largely dismissed as exaggerations from inexperienced troops. Senior German officers, many of whom had never seen combat on the Eastern Front, couldn't conceive that Soviet industry could produce technically advanced tanks in meaningful quantities. They attributed German tank losses to Soviet numerical superiority and tactical surprise, not to genuine technical advantages in Soviet tank design. By 1943, German training programs had developed comprehensive doctrine for engaging T-34 tanks that reflected this fundamental misunderstanding. Instructors taught that T-34 armor, though sloped, was actually thinner than German armor and vulnerable to German 75mm guns at normal combat ranges. The T-34's diesel engine was described as unreliable and prone to breakdown. Soviet crews were characterized as poorly trained peasants who couldn't exploit their vehicles' capabilities. German tankers absorbed these lessons and entered combat confident in their superiority. The Panzer Four Ausführung G carried armor protection increased to 80mm on the frontal hull. Its 75mm Quark 40 gun could penetrate 100mm of armor at 500 meters range, theoretically sufficient to destroy any Soviet tank. German optical sights provided superior target acquisition at long ranges. German crews received extensive training that emphasized coordinated movement and combined arms tactics. These advantages were real, but incomplete. German training doctrine assumed that engagements would occur at medium to long range, where German optical superiority and gun accuracy would dominate. Doctrine emphasized maneuvering to favorable positions and destroying Soviet tanks before they could close to effective range. German commanders believed that technical advantages would overcome Soviet numerical superiority through superior tactical employment. The actual combat environment at Kursk would violate every assumption underlying German tactical doctrine. The battlefield would be determined not by long-range precision gunnery, but by close-quarters fighting in terrain that negated German advantages. Numbers would matter more than training. Reliability would prove more valuable than sophistication. July 4, 1943. 0700 hours. The massive German artillery barrage that preceded Operation Citadel had been firing for 90 minutes, thousands of guns systematically destroying Soviet defensive positions, or attempting to. German commanders believed the bombardment would devastate Soviet defenses, allowing panzer formations to break through and exploit into the Soviet rear. The artillery fire was indeed devastating, but not in ways German planners expected. Soviet forces had constructed defensive networks reaching depths of over 150 kilometers, with multiple successive defensive lines, each protected by minefields, anti-tank ditches, and fortified positions. The artillery bombardment destroyed forward positions, but barely scratched the depth of Soviet defenses. Klaus Richter's Panzer Four rolled forward as part of the 4th Panzer Army's attack on the southern face of the Kursk salient. His company of 14 tanks advanced in textbook formation, maintaining proper intervals and coordination with supporting infantry and artillery. The morning sky was clear, visibility excellent for engaging targets at long range. The first Soviet defensive line appeared abandoned, torn apart by artillery fire. German infantry cleared the trenches, finding only destroyed equipment and occasional bodies. The Panzer Four company advanced through the breach, picking up speed as commanders gained confidence. The breakthrough seemed easier than anticipated. The first T-34 appeared at 600 meters range, emerging from a concealed position that German reconnaissance had missed. Richter's gunner acquired the target immediately, fired, and watched with satisfaction as the armor-piercing round struck the T-34's sloped frontal armor. The round ricocheted upward in a shower of sparks, causing no visible damage. The T-34's turret traversed smoothly toward Richter's tank. Before the German gunner could reload and fire again, the T-34's 76mm gun spoke. The Soviet round struck the Panzer Four's frontal armor at an angle, penetrating cleanly and detonating inside the crew compartment. Richter had exactly 1 second to register what had happened before the ammunition storage exploded, killing him and his entire crew instantly. The engagement lasted perhaps 8 seconds from first shot to final explosion. In that brief interval, everything Richter had been taught about T-34 inferiority proved catastrophically wrong. The T-34 wasn't crude. Its sloped armor worked exactly as designed, deflecting rounds that should have penetrated. Its gun was devastatingly effective at combat ranges. Its crew wasn't incompetent but deadly proficient. Across the entire Kursk battlefield, similar scenes repeated thousands of times during the first hours of Operation Citadel. German panzer formations, advancing confidently into what they believed would be easy breakthrough battles, instead encountered the most sophisticated defensive system ever constructed, defended by Soviet tank forces that were far more capable than German intelligence had suggested. The numbers told a story German commanders struggled to accept. The 4th Panzer Army, attacking from the south with over 900 tanks, advanced only 15 kilometers on the first day despite overwhelming artillery and air support. The 9th Army, attacking from the north with equal force, managed even less, gaining only 6 kilometers, against determined Soviet resistance. German after-action reports from the first day documented shocking losses. Panzer regiments that had begun the offensive with full strength reported 20 to 30% casualties by nightfall. Most losses were attributed to Soviet anti-tank guns and mines, But increasing numbers involved tank versus tank engagements, where T-34 seconds had destroyed German vehicles at ranges and under conditions that doctrine said were impossible. The reports contained a common theme that troubled German commanders. T-34 tanks were appearing in unexpected locations, engaging from concealed positions at close range, where German optical advantages didn't matter, then withdrawing before German forces could respond effectively. Soviet tanks demonstrated mobility that exceeded German capabilities, moving across terrain that German vehicles couldn't traverse. Most disturbingly, the T-34 seconds weren't breaking down. German doctrine assumed Soviet mechanical reliability would degrade rapidly under sustained operations, leaving disabled tanks scattered across the battlefield for German recovery teams to examine. Instead, T-34 formations maintained cohesion and continued engaging throughout the day without the mechanical failures that German intelligence had predicted. Night brought temporary respite but no real comfort to German tank crews. They had expected to be deep in the Soviet rear by nightfall, exploiting breakthrough and racing toward Kursk. Instead, they had barely penetrated the first defensive line and faced the prospect of resuming the attack against defenses that had proven far more formidable than anticipated. Maintenance crews worked through the darkness, repairing battle damage and conducting routine maintenance that German tanks required after even short movements. The new Panther tanks, rushed into service specifically for Operation Citadel, proved particularly problematic. Their transmissions were failing under combat stress, their engines overheating during sustained operation, their final drives breaking under loads the design couldn't handle. By contrast, captured T-34 tanks that German mechanics examined showed crude construction but sound engineering. The welds were rough but strong. The transmission, though requiring brute force to operate, functioned reliably. The diesel engine, dismissed in German training as inferior to gasoline engines, showed remarkable tolerance for abuse and poor fuel quality. German mechanics noted design features that contradicted what they had been taught about Soviet tank construction. The T-34's wide tracks, which German instructors had claimed made the vehicle slow and cumbersome, actually provided superior ground pressure and mobility in soft terrain. The sloped armor, described as a gimmick that increased weight without real benefit, proved devastatingly effective at deflecting German armor-piercing rounds. The crude interior that German training films had mocked as evidence of Soviet backwardness actually reflected pragmatic design choices. The simple controls required minimal training. The basic instruments provided essential information without unnecessary complexity. The cramped crew compartment, though uncomfortable, made the vehicle more compact and harder to hit. Every detail challenged German assumptions about tank design and Soviet industrial capability. The T-34 wasn't an inferior tank built by an inferior society. It was a purpose-built weapon designed specifically for the kind of war being fought on the Eastern Front, and it was terrifyingly effective at its intended purpose. July 5th through 10th, 1943, brought continued German attacks that achieved diminishing results against deepening Soviet defenses. Each successive defensive line proved more formidable than the last. With anti-tank guns positioned for maximum effectiveness, minefields channeling German attacks into killing zones, and T-34 tank brigades counterattacking at precisely calculated moments to disrupt German momentum. The Germans were discovering what Soviet planners had designed the entire defensive system to achieve. Operation Citadel was consuming German armored strength without achieving breakthrough, bleeding panzer divisions that Germany could not replace, while Soviet reserves remained uncommitted and fresh. German tank losses mounted with alarming speed. By July 10th, the 4th Panzer Army had lost over 300 tanks from all causes, with less than half repairable. The 9th Army's losses exceeded 400 tanks. Most shocking was the distribution of losses. Direct combat with Soviet tanks accounted for far more German casualties than doctrine predicted, while mechanical failures, which should have devastated Soviet forces, were instead disabling German vehicles at rates exceeding Soviet losses. The Panther tank, Germany's technological answer to the T-34, proved catastrophically unreliable during Operation Citadel. Of 200 Panthers committed to the offensive, More than half broke down from mechanical failures before ever engaging Soviet forces. Transmissions shattered under stress. Final drives failed after short movements. Engines caught fire from fuel system problems. Panthers that did reach combat demonstrated impressive firepower, but couldn't maintain operations long enough to matter strategically. Units had to halt advances repeatedly to recover broken Panthers, disrupting tactical momentum and providing Soviet forces time to reposition and reinforce threatened sectors. The contrast with T-34 operational availability couldn't have been more stark. Soviet tank brigades maintained combat effectiveness throughout sustained operations, with mechanical failures far below what German intelligence had predicted. T-34 tanks that were damaged in combat could often be repaired quickly in field conditions, while German vehicles required specialized equipment and skilled technicians that weren't available at the front. July 12, 1943 brought the Battle of Prokhorovka, the largest tank engagement of Operation Citadel, and one of the most significant armored battles in history. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, having achieved the deepest penetration of Soviet defenses, encountered the Soviet 5th Guards tank army in open terrain southwest of Prokhorovka. German commanders anticipated a decisive engagement where superior German tanks and crew training would devastate Soviet armor at long range. They positioned their forces to maximize advantages in firepower and optical equipment, expecting to destroy approaching Soviet tanks before they could close to effective range. The Soviet commander, Pavel Rotmistrov, understood exactly what German tactics required and deliberately denied them those conditions. Instead of approaching across open ground where German guns would dominate, Soviet tank brigades closed rapidly at maximum speed, accepting losses during the approach to reach close quarters, where T-34 advantages would overwhelm German technical superiority. The engagement began at 0830 hours, with over 800 Soviet tanks advancing in multiple waves toward German positions, defended by approximately 300 tanks and assault guns. German gunners opened fire at maximum range, destroying Soviet tanks with impressive accuracy. But the losses didn't stop the Soviet advance. T-34 tanks continued forward at full speed, closing the range from 2,000 meters to 1,000 to 500. At these closer ranges, German optical advantages meant nothing. Both sides could acquire targets easily. What mattered now was who could fire faster and maneuver more effectively. The T-34's mobility advantages became decisive at close quarters. Soviet tanks could turn faster, accelerate quicker, and traverse terrain that German vehicles couldn't cross. When the range closed to under 300 meters, German firepower, superiority ceased to matter because both sides could penetrate each other's armor reliably. The battle devolved into a chaotic close-quarters melee that lasted nearly 8 hours. Individual tank duels occurred at ranges measured in tens of meters. German crews found their training advantages neutralized by conditions where reaction speed and vehicle handling mattered more than precision gunnery or tactical sophistication. German after-action reports described scenes of nightmarish confusion. T-34 tanks, appearing unexpectedly from smoke and dust, firing at point-blank range, then withdrawing before German crews could respond. Soviet tanks ramming disabled German vehicles to clear paths for following waves. German tanks breaking down under stress of sustained maneuvering in conditions their powertrains couldn't tolerate. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps claimed to have destroyed over 400 Soviet tanks during the battle, and Soviet records confirmed devastating losses. But German forces lost approximately 200 tanks from all causes and, crucially, couldn't continue offensive operations afterward. The engagement had achieved Soviet strategic objectives by stopping German momentum without requiring Soviet forces to withdraw. Most significantly for German confidence, the battle demonstrated conclusively that T-34 tanks could engage German armor effectively, even when German forces held terrain and tactical advantages. The crude Soviet tank that German training dismissed had proven deadly effective when employed according to Soviet doctrine that emphasized mass, speed, and aggressive tactics. July 13th brought the German decision to halt Operation Citadel. Allied landings in Sicily created a strategic crisis, requiring transfer of German forces from the Eastern Front to the Mediterranean. The offensive at Kursk had failed to achieve breakthrough despite committing Germany's largest armoured force ever assembled. The impact on German tank crew morale was profound and lasting. Crews who had entered the battle confident in their superiority over Soviet equipment left it knowing that confidence had been misplaced. The T-34 wasn't the crude machine they had been promised. It was a formidable weapon that could destroy German tanks reliably when properly employed. German intelligence assessments after Kursk painted a dramatically different picture of Soviet tank capabilities than pre-battle briefings had suggested. Reports now acknowledged that T-34 production had reached industrial scale far exceeding German manufacturing. Soviet crews, while less technically trained than German crews, had developed effective tactics that exploited T-34 strengths while minimizing weaknesses. Most damaging to German confidence was the acknowledgement that Soviet tank design philosophy was fundamentally sound. The T-34's emphasis on mobility, protection, and firepower in a package that could be mass-produced had proven more effective than German focus on technical sophistication and individual vehicle superiority. The numbers from Operation Citadel told the story clearly. Germany had committed over 2,700 tanks and assault guns to the offensive. Total losses exceeded over 800 vehicles from all causes, with less than half recoverable or repairable. Soviet losses were far higher in absolute numbers, but Soviet industry was producing replacement tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. The mathematics of industrial attrition had shifted decisively against Germany. Every T-34 destroyed was replaced by 2 new ones from Soviet factories operating beyond German bomber range. Every German tank lost was becoming increasingly difficult to replace as Allied strategic bombing disrupted German production and raw material shortages worsened. German tank crews began receiving captured Soviet training materials that revealed how differently Soviet doctrine approached armored warfare. Where German doctrine emphasized individual tank superiority and crew excellence, Soviet doctrine emphasized mass employment and aggressive tactics that accepted high losses to achieve decisive results. Soviet training methods, once dismissed as primitive, actually produced crews specifically prepared for the kind of close-quarters combat that had characterized Prokhorovka. Soviet crews trained extensively in rapid firing, quick movement between firing positions, and coordinated actions with multiple tanks working together. The T-34's design supported this tactical approach perfectly. Its diesel engine, though producing less horsepower than comparable German engines, responded quickly to throttle inputs and provided excellent low-speed torque for maneuvering in combat. The wide tracks enabled rapid direction changes that would bog down German tanks. The high ground clearance allowed Soviet tanks to traverse terrain German vehicles had to avoid. Even features German training had mocked, as deficiencies proved advantageous in actual combat. The T-34's simple 2-man turret, criticized for overworking the tank commander who had to acquire targets, load ammunition, and command the vehicle simultaneously, actually provided faster reaction times in close combat compared to German 3-man turrets with separate loader positions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Post-Kursk intelligence reports documented Soviet tank production capabilities that shocked German industrial planners. The Tankograd complex in Chelyabinsk was producing over 1,500 T-34 tanks monthly. The Gorky plant added another 1,000 tanks per month. Factory number 183 and smaller facilities contributed additional hundreds. Soviet monthly T-34 production exceeded total German tank production of all types by factors of 3 to 4. The industrial disparity was overwhelming and growing worse as Allied bombing degraded German manufacturing capacity, while Soviet factories operated undisturbed. German mechanics who examined knocked-out T-34 tanks after Kursk discovered details that further challenged their assumptions about Soviet industrial capability. Component quality had improved dramatically since 1941. Welds, though still rough compared to German standards, showed consistent quality and proper penetration. Castings displayed fewer defects. Assembly was more careful despite continued emphasis on production speed. The improvements reflected Soviet industry learning from combat experience and implementing quality control measures without sacrificing production rates. This combination of high volume and improving quality was exactly what German industry was failing to achieve, as raw material shortages and labor disruptions degraded German manufacturing. The T-34's evolution during the war demonstrated Soviet ability to refine designs based on combat feedback while maintaining production. The T-34, 85 variant, introduced in late 1943, mounted an 85mm gun in an enlarged three-man turret that addressed the original T-34's main weaknesses while retaining all its advantages. The new variant could engage German Tiger and Panther tanks effectively at normal combat ranges, eliminating the German advantage in firepower that had existed earlier. Yet Soviet industry transitioned to T-34, 85 production without disrupting overall output, a feat German industry never accomplished when introducing new tank models. By late 1943, German tank doctrine began incorporating painful lessons from Kursk and subsequent battles. Training programs now acknowledged T-34 capabilities honestly, rather than dismissing Soviet equipment as crude and inferior. Tactical manuals emphasized avoiding close-quarters combat where T-34 advantages would dominate. But doctrinal changes couldn't overcome mathematical reality. Germany was losing the industrial war. Soviet tank production exceeded German production by margins that made tactical excellence increasingly irrelevant. Every T-34 destroyed was quickly replaced while German losses accumulated and depleted irreplaceable strength. German tank crews who survived Kursk and subsequent Eastern Front battles developed grim respect for the T-34 and its crews. Post-war interviews with German veterans consistently described the T-34 as the most dangerous opponent they faced, more fearsome than American Shermans, despite the Shermans' technical sophistication. The respect came from hard-won knowledge that T-34 tanks would keep coming regardless of losses, operated by crews who fought with determination and skill, produced by an industrial system that could absorb punishment and continue functioning. The T-34 embodied everything that made the Soviet war effort so difficult to defeat: resilience, numerical superiority, and sound engineering applied at massive scale. The contrast between German and Soviet tank development philosophy became painfully clear through the Kursk experience. German designers pursued technical perfection, creating tanks with impressive specifications that were difficult to produce and maintain. Soviet designers pursued practical effectiveness, creating tanks that were simple to build and deadly to encounter. The Tiger tank, entering service in late 1942, mounted an 88mm gun and armor up to 120mm thick. It could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. But Germany produced only 1,347 Tigers during the entire war because each tank required extensive precision manufacturing and scarce materials. The T-34, with less impressive specifications, could be manufactured by the thousands monthly using conventional industrial processes and readily available materials. When both tank types encountered each other in combat, the Tiger often won individual engagements. But there were never enough Tigers to matter strategically because Soviet numerical superiority overwhelmed German technical advantages. This fundamental truth shaped the remainder of the war on the Eastern Front. Germany continued developing more advanced tanks, the Panther improving on earlier designs, the King Tiger representing the ultimate expression of German tank engineering. Each new model was technically impressive and performed well in individual combat. None of it mattered because Soviet industry produced T-34 tanks faster than German forces could destroy them. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Germany could build approximately 1,000 tanks monthly at peak production. The Soviet Union was producing over 3,000 T-34 tanks monthly by mid-1943 and increasing. German industrial capacity was declining under Allied strategic bombing and raw material shortages. Soviet production was increasing as factories improved. Efficiency and additional facilities came online. The gap widened inexorably month after month, creating conditions where German tactical excellence became strategically irrelevant. By 1944, Soviet tank forces were conducting operations that would have been impossible earlier in the war. Operation Bagration in June and July 1944 employed over 5,000 tanks, overwhelming German defences through sheer mass and speed. The Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945 concentrated over 7,000 tanks for breakthrough operations that carried Soviet forces from Poland to Germany in weeks. German forces couldn't match these concentrations. Panzer divisions that had begun the war with over 200 tanks were operating with 30 to 50 vehicles by 1944. Replacement tanks arrived slowly and were inferior in quality to earlier production as German industry deteriorated. Fuel shortages limited training and operations. Experienced crews were killed or captured and replaced by inadequately trained personnel. The T-34 had achieved its designer's vision perfectly. It wasn't the best tank in any single category. It didn't have the Tiger's gun or armor. It lacked the Panther's sophisticated fire control. Its interior was cramped and uncomfortable compared to American Shermans. What it had was brutal effectiveness at winning the kind of war being fought on the Eastern Front. It could be produced in overwhelming numbers. It could be maintained by mechanics with basic training. It could operate reliably under conditions that disabled more sophisticated machines. It could be operated effectively by crews with limited technical education. Most importantly, it kept coming in numbers that German forces couldn't match. The story of German tank crews laughing at the T-34's crude design, then discovering its deadly effectiveness at Kursk, encapsulates the entire German experience on the Eastern Front. German confidence based on technical superiority and tactical excellence encountered Soviet resilience based on industrial mass and pragmatic engineering. The Germans won most individual engagements. They destroyed more Soviet tanks than they lost. Their crews demonstrated superior tactical proficiency. Their equipment showed better craftsmanship and precision. None of it mattered because the Soviet Union could absorb losses that would cripple Germany and continue fighting with undiminished strength. The T-34's victory wasn't won through technical excellence or innovative design features. It was won through relentless mathematics. Soviet factories produced over 60,000 T-34 tanks during the war, more than all German tank production combined. This numerical superiority, combined with adequate technical capability and doctrine that employed tanks effectively, proved decisive. German veterans interviewed decades after the war consistently identified the T-34 as the weapon that most impressed and disturbed them. Not because it was the most dangerous. German crews feared Tigers and Panthers from their own side being captured and used against them, but because the T-34 represented everything that made the Eastern Front unwinnable. It symbolized Soviet industrial might that Germany couldn't match. It embodied Soviet willingness to accept casualties that would be unthinkable for Germany. It demonstrated Soviet pragmatism in weapon design that prioritized effectiveness over elegance. It proved that technical superiority alone couldn't win wars against opponents with greater resources and industrial capacity. The crude design German crews had mocked in 1941 became the symbol of German defeat by 1945. The ungainly tank with rough welds and basic optics had crushed the Wehrmacht through sheer persistence and weight of numbers. The elegant German engineering that produced Tigers and Panthers had proven strategically irrelevant against an opponent who understood that wars are won in factories as much as battlefields. The final accounting of the T-34's impact reveals numbers that tell the complete story. Soviet industry produced over 64,000 T-34 tanks between 1940 and 1945. Germany produced approximately 24,000 tanks of all types during the same period. The mathematical disparity made German defeat inevitable, regardless of tactical skill or technical sophistication. At Kursk specifically, the Germans committed over 2,700 tanks and lost over 800. The Soviets committed over 5,000 tanks and lost over 1,500. Both sides lost significant numbers, but the differential impact was decisive. German losses represented irreplaceable strength that couldn't be regenerated. Soviet losses were replaced within weeks from continuous production. The Battle of Kursk marked the end of German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. After July 1943, German forces never again conducted major offensive operations in the East. The remainder of the war consisted of Soviet offensives driving German forces steadily westward toward final defeat in Berlin. The T-34 didn't win the Eastern Front alone. Soviet victory required the efforts of millions of soldiers, sophisticated combined arms doctrine, strategic leadership, and industrial mobilization on unprecedented scale. But the T-34 provided the armored capability that made Soviet victory possible, combining adequate technical capability with production numbers that overwhelmed German opposition. German tank crews who survived the war carried memories of the T-34 that shaped their understanding of armored warfare forever. They learned that technical excellence matters less than reliability and numbers. They discovered that elegant engineering means nothing if industrial capacity can't support it. They realized that wars are won by the side that can sustain operations over years, not the side that wins individual battles. The story of the T-34 at Kursk provides lessons that remain relevant decades later. It demonstrates that weapon effectiveness depends on far more than technical specifications. Production capability, maintenance requirements, crew training demands, and tactical doctrine all matter as much as armor, thickness, or gun penetration. It shows that industrial capacity often decides wars more than battlefield excellence. The Germans were better soldiers, operating superior equipment. They still lost because the Soviet Union could outproduce Germany while fielding adequate equipment, operated by adequately trained crews. Adequacy in massive quantities beats excellence in limited numbers. Most fundamentally, it proves that assumptions about enemy capabilities can be fatally wrong. German commanders entered Operation Citadel, believing Soviet tank forces were crude and inferior. That belief was based on propaganda, limited information, and cultural prejudice, rather than objective assessment. When reality contradicted assumption, German forces paid in blood and steel. The T-34 medium tank stands as testament to effective weapon design. Not the most sophisticated tank of World War II, not the most comfortable or ergonomic, not the best protected or most heavily armed, but unquestionably the most effective at achieving its strategic purpose, helping destroy the Wehrmacht through industrial mass applied with adequate tactical competence. German tank crews learned this lesson the hard way, starting at Kursk and continuing through 3 years of continuous retreat. The crude design they had mocked proved to be revolutionary. The ugly tank they had dismissed proved to be deadly. The primitive machine they had been taught to despise proved to be the weapon that crushed German military power on the Eastern Front. In the final analysis, the T-34's victory over German armor wasn't won through superior technology or innovative features. It was won through brutal mathematics and pragmatic engineering. The Soviet Union built more tanks than Germany could destroy, operated them adequately enough to kill German tanks reliably, and sustained production at levels Germany couldn't match regardless of tactical victories. The German tank crews who laughed at the T-34's ugly design learned the hardest lesson of armored warfare. Pretty doesn't win wars. Reliable wins wars. Simple wins wars. Mass production wins wars. The T-34 was all of those things, and that's exactly why it crushed the Panzerwaffe at Kursk and carried the Red Army all the way to Berlin. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.